Seth, good evening. Happy Tuesday evening, buddy.
Happy Tuesday to you, Scott. It's been a bit thanks to my day job work schedule. Believe it or not, people, we actually do have other jobs besides this podcast. So I was caught up last week traveling, but I appreciate your patience, Scott, and happy to be back at it.
Yeah, no, it's good. For those, I'm still living at home, and part of my job is taking out the trash. So Monday's trash day, and then today's grocery day. So I'm out there with my mom, picking up low sodium foods, make sure everyone's healthy, doing a lot of soups.
You got to keep the menu tight. I like it. Someone's got to be responsible for that kind of stuff.
Soups, I'm telling you, man, that's one of the greatest things about old age, man. You can have soup any time of the day, and it's just all good anytime. Well, one of the things to our audience, Seth and I, we were actually trying to plan a trip back in the fall. Just things happen, people get busy, but where we're going to go, Seth, we were going to try to hit Muscle Shoals Studio and Sun Studios in Tennessee and Alabama. And we thought tonight we would talk about the studio, which I won't say it's like the fifth member that never gets talked about. But when you look into how you create the sound, the studio is almost as important as the musicians themselves.
I agree. And I actually think the idea of sort of the fifth member of the band is not an outrageous thing to say. I think if you look at the history of rock music, there's so many bands in so many albums, so many songs, but there's actually not that many historic studios. Once bands are famous and they have their pick of the litter, it seems like these bands end up at the same 10 places. So there absolutely is a few different components as to why certain studios resonate with musicians, but to call it kind of a part of the sound at the very least is more than reasonable thing to do, I think, based on the history of what we've seen.
It's unbelievable as you dive into it. I mean, you always hear about the producers, right? You have Quincy Jones, you have just these famous producers that even in all the documentaries they'll talk about because they do shape the sound. But you never hear about the actual space. They may mention it like this was recorded at Sun Studios or this was recorded at Muscle Shoals, but they don't actually say why it was important or how it influenced the sound. And there's a number of aspects when you actually think about it. And so we have a list here, but I think the number one are like, you hear about this when you're going to see symphonies and whatnot, but the acoustics. And what does that mean? Because it's like kind of this catchphrase. People say, go to the symphony here in Chicago, the acoustics are amazing. And you're like, yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know why.
Yeah, no, it's a good question and and I'm probably not the best one to explain it, but there is a science to the sound of music, right? The way that the sounds bounce off or absorbed by the walls, the way the different sound waves interact with each other. We'll talk about some unique features of the studios that we have on our list that affect the acoustics of the sound. And the reality is, like, you can throw a bunch of blankets or egg crates in a small little room and create a tampering effect that makes sure your sound doesn't echo and kind of get away with it. But sometimes there's a room, there's materials that were used. It's often in buildings that were not originally designed to be music studios that have these unique features. Because again, if you design from the ground up, you tend to towards this middle of perfection in sound. And I think the ones that have had the most impact in music are those that have imperfections that make them distinct. And so how the drum parts sound or how the voices come together because of the high ceilings, all of those things affect the final recorded product. And if there's an artist who has an idea of something specific they're going for, now you can recreate all those things digitally. It's a much different world and kind of studios and how they're used now versus 50 years ago. But there was a time when you couldn't fake that. You either had to find the sound in the room, as they say, or you didn't. And so that's why these studios were so important. I would say increasingly are less so as they go digital, and as recording technology is perfected. But there was a time when it was like totally the fifth member of the band, which is why I think there's so much historical cachet to these certain places and people still talk about them with reverence today.
Yeah, and I think from one aspect that most people probably don't know is that, these bands, although they have a lot of money and you hear about the rock star lifestyle, a lot of times in the beginning, they are how do I say it? The studios, they don't own the studios. These are rented. Even the record label doesn't own the studio. So this is a private business that you're going in and enlisting the services of the engineers and sometimes even the house bands. So it brings in another I'd say variable, as you'd mentioned, Seth, into the sound. It almost has this idea. To me, when I was first reading about it, it's almost like wine. You know, the wood is this old and it's going to yield this barrel taste. And there's all these specifics that you just can't. They're not a commodity, as you said. It's just not like, hey, we're recording on Spotify and everything's going to sound the same.
Yeah.
And as we look at this idea of this outsourced kind of area, we said the producer and the bands. I mean, look at Abbey Road Studios with George Martin, and some of the house bands that I think that you and I were going to go visit in Muscle Shoals in Alabama.
Yeah,
that
there's all
like
these. And there's a few different business models, for lack of a way to say it. There's sort of this true studio for hire, where if you're a band, it's just like we've got blocks of time. It's our guys, it's our backup singers, it's our. If you need a grand piano, you use ours. It's just you rent the time. There's somewhere, if a band is signed to a particular record label, the label might own the studio, as is the case with what was formerly called EMI. It is now called Abbey Road. But it was sort of like, if you're on their label, you get to use their studio time. It's and actually there was a recent documentary about Abbey Road. We get into this, but one of the things McCartney said, he's like, the best part about being on EMI was Abbey Road was free, because it was we owned it, or our record label owned it. There was a lot of stuff we didn't make money from and didn't get paid for, but we basically got to screw around in this label owned studio for as long as we wanted, which was a huge part of their creative process. So all of these different, and then later on, once bands become more famous, or once individual producers like a George Martin, like a Rick Rubin, become famous enough, they'll often build their own studios to their exacting standards. But it doesn't mean they use those exclusively. They'll often drift back to the places that they started at to get certain sounds. But those are, I almost feel like, the three lanes. It's like the ones you control completely and you built yourself, the ones your record label owns and you're a little bit beholden to them, but you sort of get free run of the place. And then the true sort of outsourcing, this is a space for hire, and you get all the resources that come with it. So it's a strategic investment by your band or by your label to stick you there. Yeah, well, absolutely.
Because in some cases, you'll hear about this band or this album that was rushed out, right? And they had almost, people don't realize it is a business. And so if you had 2 weeks left in the recording studio, you bang out these songs that maybe weren't optimized, and hence the album gets a bad rating. And so you can start to understand a little bit of why there is a business machine behind it, almost like a project manager. And these studios are like, yeah, man, another band's coming in another week. So you guys got 5 more songs. You better do them. This happens to big bands.
You often hear about, like we've talked a lot in the show about excess, right? And often that means partying or drugs or women, but there's financial excess that a lot of these bands are very guilty of. I mean, I think it was Tusk by Fleetwood Mac that they famously spent like $1 million of studio time just fucking around, because they were just like, what? It's not our money. We can light it on fire. We can spend weeks in the studio doing nothing because no one's going to tell us otherwise. So there's even that component of it where, again, famously, like the first Beatles record was recorded like 1 day or 2, like 36 hours. It was like 10 songs and they put it out. And then the reverse of it, as you get into the late 60s, early 70s, it's just like abuse of this time, where bands would live in the studio, they would hang out, they would bring people in, but the only thing they weren't doing was recording new music. It was just very wasteful, but it's an expensive proposition, especially at some of these more famous studios. Yeah.
Well, another aspect that's maybe a less tangible, or let's say an intangible, is the vibe. Yeah. You know, just like any location, whether it's a restaurant or bar or whatever, there's a certain vibe. And one of the coolest things was hearing some of the, these musicians talk about, we had to go here because we heard it has this creative vibe to it, or this dark vibe, whatever they were looking for. There was a certain location that has it. And it makes sense when you actually look at the locations and structures of these studios.
Yeah. And some of it is the physical studio, and some of it is the people that work in it, and some of it is just actually the location. I think famously, like Muscle Shoals, which was Fame Studios, and then Muscle Shoals Sound Studios, which is where the Swampers went when they kind of like started their own business. Bands like the Rolling Stones were like, we want our record to sound like the American South. We want our record to sound like a swamp. We talked about this a little bit during our like regions of the country series.
Yeah.
But it was there was a literal sound component, but then there was also a cultural component where they're like, if we want to get this vibe, we need to immerse ourselves in this place. And I think that is just one more thing you need to think about when you're picking a studio and you have an infinite budget like the Rolling Stones.
Well, let's get into it, Seth. So as we start to look at the most legendary studios in the world, what's the first one that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think Abbey Road is the first one that comes to everybody's mind because of and we do it a lot in this show, but let's kind of go in a funky order here. I'm going to start with one that people, well, the records that came out of it, you may not know the studio. It may not be as famous.
Yeah.
And that studio is Hansa Studios in Berlin. A fascinating place that a lot of good music's come out from. We'll get into the albums, but this originally was designed as, like I said, in Berlin. The idea is we're going to be recording, we're going to be artist development, we're going to be promotional company. It was going to be this all-in-one music business, really focused initially on West German musicians. This is a place that opened up originally in the early 60s, but kind of really came into its own mid to late 70s. At its height, had 5 different studio rooms working. The thought was like, this is going to be a music factory. There's places that can work around the clock. We can record orchestras. We could record spoken word. We've got a studio that is literally just for training of engineers and producers, just to kind of learn their very complex equipment. But they had sort of different locations throughout this complex over the years, and stayed very, very busy with a lot of different types of music. A few albums that were recorded there that I'm sure you've heard of. A couple albums by David Bowie, Low, Heroes, Ball, late 70s, early 80s. A bunch of Iggy Pop records, Depeche Mode, Achtung Baby, which I know is a favorite of yours, Scott, in 1991.
Yep, that's right.
Stuff by Nick Cave, REM, The Hives, Snow Patrol. So right up until now, this is a very busy working studio that's both like a historical relic and an important piece of music history. A band I love called Parcels, which I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, did their live album kind of front to back recorded at Hansa Studios. So this is still a very busy working studio, but really has an important place in music history and a pretty diverse set of musicians that have recorded there. So it's really just the highest of the high tech, in very thoughtfully built and acoustically shaped rooms within that building. So do you have any thoughts or experiences with Hansa, Scott?
I gotta say, and I know it's the first one, this is my favorite by far, and this had a huge impact when Achtung Baby came out. And as everyone knows, I was a U2 fan, then I wasn't a fan, and when Achtung Baby came out, this is when I was like, man, I'll give them one more chance, because I hated Rattle and Hum, and it blew my mind. I just worshiped this album, and I wanted to know everything about it. And so Bono and the crew had learned about Hansa Studios because it was famous from a lot of with David Bowie and Iggy Pop, their idols. And this was at the time when the Berlin Wall in 89, 90, when it was just this whole reunification. And so they weren't just dedicated followers of like political stuff. They actually wanted this sound, and they talked about a very European sound, right? Rattle and Hum and Joshua Tree were very American, so they wanted to go kind of the other way. And I saw footage of the studio, and it's called Hansa by the Wall, which is literally right by the Berlin Wall. And it was everything that that wasn't in Southern California. It was cold, it was gray, it had that Euro look, and it influenced me so much that I went and I applied to study abroad in Europe. And Seth, me, I've lived across many countries and whatnot. And this album, and watching them record the song One, and Bono's in black, it looked like this SNL Sprockets. You may not remember this, but this is an old Eastern German skit, and it was so indelible in my mind that it influenced me. And one day I've been to Berlin many times, but I never went to the studio. But this to me, all the albums that you mentioned, they're very, it's a very European sound. It's very, I'd say dark, a little more industrial. And it's beautiful. It's just like, it's amazing. So yeah.
And I think you can hear it in the music too. I again, as someone who never put the studio with the sound together, even thinking about the song Heroes by Bowie, like that sounds not, it sounds, I don't know. It doesn't sound, I don't
like
know.
Motown,
it doesn't sound American.
Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like a Motown studio, right?
Yeah. It's a little cold, but still like, there's something like almost like post-apocalyptic about it a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know that it totally, I think that a lot of that is from the DNA of the studio.
Yeah. That's right.
Cool. We got to get some Hansa Studio t-shirts, I think.
Yeah, we got to go in there. So Seth, what's next, buddy?
So we'll keep it rolling. The next one I've got in here is Sunset Sound Recorders. A lot of these studios start to sound alike, by the way. But Sunset Sound Recorders was a studio started by Tutti Camerota. This is a guy that was basically the lead sound engineer for the Walt Disney Company. So all the old movies, it was his job to write the scores, record the scores, and kind of manage all the music component of it. And so at the encouragement and I think financial support of Walt Disney, they converted an old automotive shop into a studio. And apparently, again, this is where the sort of the science of it comes in. There was something about this funky, odd sloping floor that they had in the garage that reduced like sound wave feedback. Like they would almost get like this kind of like in some studios. And how this building was constructed, not for music, just like for how it was built, avoided a lot of that. So it kind of became a very desirable place, and it was still used for Disney recordings. Bedknobs and Broomsticks, Mary Poppins, 101 Dalmatians. They were, all of the soundtracks and the scores for those were recorded in the studio. But it's also an insanely prolific studio. Now, I'm sure much of that has to do with the location. This is in Los Angeles, so it's where musicians already are. But I was stunned by the stat. So this studio has over 200 gold records to its name. 200 different songs recorded here, sold at least 100,000 copies at some point, which is an insane number. Some you've heard of, I'm sure. Prince's Purple Rain, I mean, one of the biggest albums of the 80s. Exile on Main Street, which is really one of my favorite Stones records. The Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, to me, is like that alone, which is such a experimental studio forward record where so much of it is like, we're going to do weird stuff and we want to use these big rooms. Like that alone, you could build a business on Pet Sounds having been recorded at your studio.
Yeah.
And then they went and had 199 other records that also did the same thing. And Scott, one of your favorites, their first two records, The Doors recorded here. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, this studio for me growing up in Southern California, this is like this is our right to win, as we would say, for LA music. It's iconic. It's especially right by me in the next town over. This is where Van Halen started, and so Van Halen recorded there as well. But I think with the Doors, it really put this LA on the map, coming from New York, right? I think traditionally the music industry was in New York, and then it came out. So all these albums are just, I can't say it's an LA sound. It's just more of, how do I say this? It's just so prolific that it established Los Angeles just as this place to go record. And you're going to have great work, no matter what it is. It could be dark like the Doors album, or just a pure rock album like Van Halen, or Pet Sounds,
or the Mary Poppins soundtrack, right? Like it's
or
actually
Disney.
The diversity of sound that's recorded there, and of course that means big groups, small groups, and everyone in between. Talk about being at the right place at the right time. Late 50s in Los Angeles, right as rock music is becoming a thing, and that's becoming the epicenter of it. No surprise that it's so prolific. Yeah. So cool. Sticking in that little corner of the world, you can see where I'm going to get confused here. The next one we're talking about is called Sound City Recordings. This is a studio in Van Nuys?
Van Nuys. You got it, buddy. In the valley. It's in the valley.
Yeah, so a little bit off the beaten path, but this is a studio particularly famous for their investment in technology and analog technology. So this is a studio that was built in an old Vox amplifier factory that they took over, and for whatever reason had this, that it's famous for its drum sound. So people, they put the set right in the middle of their main studio, and they said just the reverberation on it and the bigness of the drums, they couldn't get anywhere else. So literally a lot of big albums were recorded here, but in some cases just the drum tracks of certain albums, they came here specifically to record. I also mentioned the money they spent. They in the 70s, they bought a board. It was not a company, it was this guy. His name is Rupert Neve. I've seen videos. He's like this, he looks like an old British scientist, but he was a he was an electronics nerd, and he built what he felt was the best soundboard you could ever build. And there's no automation whatsoever. It's all analog. It's all switches. It's all little what's the word I'm looking for? Little fuses. Like, it's truly this massive thing, but massively difficult to deal with. There were only 4 of them ever built. And again, there was a documentary about the studio, but ostensibly about this soundboard that's just called Sound City. And eventually Dave Grohl, with all that Nirvana and Foo Fighters money, bought this soundboard for $500,000 that he now has in his own home studio. But this is, a lot of claims to fame. So the first song ever recorded here was for the first album by Buckingham Nicks, which them meeting people there and hearing the album caused them to be invited to join Fleetwood Mac, which we know how that ended pretty lucratively.
Yeah,
pretty well.
That was a win.
That was a strong decision by them to pivot. Absolutely. This is a studio that Rick Rubin recorded a lot of his artists out on the West Coast before he bought Shangri-La from guys in the band. And this was where he'd take people. On the East Coast, he had places in New York, but on the West Coast, he went to Sound City. Some albums and artists you probably heard of. Neil Young did After the Gold Rush here, among others, a bunch of stuff with Crazy Horse, stuff by Dr. John. One of the songs, I forget the name, but one of the songs off of Rumors was recorded here. So they have the claim to fame of one of the biggest albums of the 20th century. Joe Cocker, favorite of mine. Dio later on in the 80s, right up into the Black Crowes, and even some Nirvana stuff was recorded at Sound City as well. So this is another one that spans the decades. And there's also an aspect of an artist hears that their idol recorded somewhere, and they need to, not even for the sound, but like you spoke about, for the vibe, for the energy of the room of, holy shit, they fucking recorded a Rumor song here. We got to go there. So I think you hear a lot about that in Sound City. Do you know the area, Scott? Tell me a little bit about where this place is.
Yeah, so it's in the valley. So if everyone has seen Karate Kid, or recently Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, this is where Brad Pitt was working around the Van Nuys Theater. It's over the hill, right, through Laurel Canyon, where all the hipsters in the 60s lived, and it's just this massive kind of San Fernando Valley. And it's at the time it was kind of middle class area. It wasn't Beverly Hills, and I find it funny. I remember reading about the Black Crowes hanging out in Van Nuys and Woodland Hills and all these kind of little valley cities. And you're just thinking about them, man. They're probably, they're from Georgia. Here they are trying to get this sound, this big sound, and they're hanging out. But there's really, I think, that creativity. I think there's something inspiring, almost like if you were a writer and you're in the house of Mark Twain or something. Or I think that, to me, is that intangible that creates this beautiful sound. I mean, I always think it's funny when you have like Led Zeppelin or these kind of English bands coming over and recording in studios, and conversely the other way, and trying to mix, like, what is the Rolling Stones doing here? They're not having tea, they're having like a In-N-Out hamburger.
I think that's a great point, that cross-poll, or like everybody wants what they don't have, right? I again, another constant reference on the show is that History of the Eagles documentary. But I remember Glenn Fry saying, like, we're going to Beatle country to record with Glyn Johns at Olympic Studios. And they're just like, the idea that they're in England, like, that meant so much to them. Yeah. And then you have British bands the same thing happening. It's like this exchange program
Mm-hmm.
of musicianship and sharing ideas and sharing engineers and all those things.
Yeah.
So very funny to think about those guys being kind of fish out of water at this.
Yeah.
And by the way, there was nothing particularly glamorous about Sound City either. It was famously like, to talk about the vibe, it was like there were weird people would pee on the floor. Like there was nothing nice about it except the sound that came out of it, which is what kept it open for so long.
Yeah.
So.
And when you think about these albums, you're like, what part of that was in there? I think to me, with Achtung Baby, it was such a clear direction. Like, these guys were definitely going Europe. It was exactly what I was kind of looking for in life. Wanted to leave America and see other parts of the world. It's just an underappreciated aspect of music. I'm so stoked to talk about this because it's like, hey man, you got to realize location matters. Yeah.
And I think you do hear about you hit the nail on the head there with like a band searching for a sound, and it'll be like, this one was recorded in Texas. The next album was recorded in Latvia. The next one was recorded in a chateau in France. And I guess again, the Stones are most famous for this, where they have the money, the resources, and the interest of like, we're going to go wherever it takes to get this particular sound we think we need.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's set up and again, like I know a bunch of Chili Pepper stuff was recorded in like an abandoned haunted mansion in Hollywood, and like they were recording vocals in the shower and stuff. Like, you just hear all these crazy improvisations, but it's once again just trying to seek out that particular sound. So
and the stories, of some, and I would just encourage anyone, if you look at your favorite songs, favorite albums, there's usually a story behind where they're recorded. As a huge Led Zeppelin fan, I wanted to know, okay, where was this album made and who else was there? And you hear the stories. And I think it's also interesting, all the other artists, like, for example, when Led Zeppelin recorded Led Zeppelin 4, right? The famous album with Stairway to Heaven. Genesis had just recorded something before. And it's like almost like a hotel room that they're, hey guys, we're just leaving now, you're coming in. And the stories they would tell each other. Almost like a little community. And I find that fascinating because I think in today's world, people would do it in their, here's my home studio. This is how I want to control every aspect. But to have that kind of shared sound, if you will, it's kind of cool. It makes it interesting.
I agree. And there's so many stories like this. One of them we touched on another episode, but that like Bowie and Queen were recording in this like Swiss Alps studio at the same time, and they were just kind of bored, killing time, and that turned into Under Pressure. You hear about artists like, hey, I was there the day they recorded X, and that inspired me to go write Y. And like it's that the cross-pollination at these big studios, it's a crossroads for ideas. It's really that social piece is something we didn't really plan to talk about, but there's countless stories of those kinds of things happening.
And you mentioned, we've talked about kind of these big legendary studios, but as you said, a lot of these sounds were created in almost obscure settings intentionally. If you think about just the concept of sound, right? If you record in a bathroom versus a huge living room versus outside, it's going to produce something different. And so I found it really interesting that a lot of these producers, I remember reading about, I think Martin, forgot his last name, but producer of Joy Division, and how he wanted to create a certain drum sound. And so he would make the drummer go up to the roof and lock him in some like little like attic, whatever, and record, and just trying to get something different. And so it's just endless, these stories. And we've only touched on the first 5 here.
Yeah, we'll do the other one. It's funny you say that. I was just making dinner and listening to Low Life, the album by New Order, and I was thinking, I was like, this drum sound is so distinctive. So it's funny you brought that up. This is fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
So let's speed by 2 more, and then we can wrap things up. But I think important to touch. The first one is more of a historical honor, and we've talked about it in other episodes and earlier this one, and that's Sun Studio in Memphis. Really not about the sound, but important because of its place in musical history. This is where what is argued to be the first rock and roll song recorded, the first rock and roll single, which is the Delta Cats song Rocket 88. The Delta Cats were actually a secret front for Ike Turner's band, but they wanted to kind of like make them a little more like racially ambiguous. So that album was I believe 1958. Does that sound right, Scott? And early legends, people like Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, Junior Parker, and others recorded there. But obviously, Sun Studios' big claim to fame is where Elvis first recorded. He supposedly walked in planning to record a song for his mom. Ended up, they liked the sound so much they stashed it away. They brought him back. They figured out how to package him up and market him, and the rest is history. But
yeah,
early in his career, Sun Studios and Sam Phillips, the guy who owned that studio, were the ones to realize like there's something here, and take that obviously to really be the first major rock star. That's where the $1 Million Quartet situation happened, where it was Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, all jamming in the same room. Just so many famous stories in it. Unfortunately, turned into like a hardware store by the 70s. It was obviously more about it being a
Ace
meeting
Hardware.
place. But, yeah, for the helpful hardware folks. But so that's that. I thought it was worth mentioning. And then the last one we'll breeze through because we've talked about it a million times. But Abbey Road. I mean, that is, I think, the one for even casual music fans that's synonymous with like band, sound, time, studio. Abbey Road, originally called EMI. Built in 1831 as a 12-bedroom home, then purchased by the company in 28, converted in 1931 into what it became now, which is the Courtyard, became Studio One, which is where the London Symphony Orchestra records. A lot of BBC stuff was done there early on. Was really like a business, was not, talk about vibe. It was like the anti-vibe. It was guys in pressed shirts and ties.
Lab
if you're
coats.
the engineer, if you're the engineer, you can't touch that. If you're like, it was very by the book and very British, very old school. Really until the late 60s. It was think of it like IBM. Like that's what it was. It was run like science rather than an art. And obviously the Beatles changed all of that. Recorded almost everything from 62 to 70 there, with a very few exceptions. And then other artists at the time, Donovan, the Hollies, a little early Pink Floyd, Fela Kuti, Kate Bush, Duran Duran, and then Alan Parsons Project, which you've heard about. Alan Parsons was actually an engineer at Abbey Road.
Yeah.
So really this epicenter of sound and kind of the science of sound, that was one of the places that it emerged. So, okay, that's my quick 1 minute on Abbey Road. I know we're nearing the end of our time, but so much more to learn. A handful of these studios that we've discussed today have standalone documentaries if you want to learn more, that are fascinating about the bands that were there, why they're so important. So we're just really giving the cliff notes, but there's so much here to dive in if this topic interests you. So just wanted to do that little plug.
Yeah, no, that's right, Seth. And I just encourage anyone, literally go on. And the greatest thing about Wikipedia, type in your favorite song, click on it, go to Wikipedia, and they'll give usually the location where they recorded. And I guarantee you the stories are amazing. There's one in Headley Grange, right, where Led Zeppelin, I mentioned, did Led Zeppelin 4. They said it was haunted. And so there's all these like crazy stories, or as you said, the chateau in France where they did some of the Exile, like just wacky stories about what went on. Even bands like Oasis and the whole Brit wave, and it's just it's cool. But listen, everyone, first of all, thank you for all the feedback you've been giving us, and all of our loyal listeners. Just want to say thanks. Tell us which studio you want to visit, any stories that you've heard. We welcome your feedback, and we'll see you guys next week.
Cool. Thanks, Scott.
Studio.
Catch you in the studio.
Okay, buddy. See
All
ya.
right, man.
See ya.
Bye.